To millions of viewers, Malcolm was Theo Huxtable, the only son in America's most famous television family. But to Bill, he was simply the 13-year-old boy who had grown up right before his eyes and kept turning to him decades after the set went dark. At 89, Bill Cosby finally broke his silence through the very thing that had kept him and Malcolm connected for all those years, a phone call. And in that moment, Bill still spoke of Malcolm as though he might pick up the phone at any time. Because Theo Huxtable was never entirely a product of imagination. Behind that character was someone from Bill's own family, a connection Malcolm carried with him for the rest of his life, and a tragedy that Bill never truly escaped. To understand why Malcolm's death reopened that old wound, we have to go back to the years before The Cosby Show, long before Bill became known to the world as America's dad. William Henry Cosby Jr. was born July 12, 1937, in Philadelphia, the oldest of 4 sons raised by a mother who worked as a maid and a father who served in the Navy. Money was never easy to come by. Bill was never the star student. He loved sports and making people laugh more than sitting still with a book, and he left school for good in the 10th grade. It could have ended there, but he had one gift no one taught him. He could take something that had once embarrassed him and turn it into a story a whole room would laugh at. In 1956, he joined the Navy as a hospital corpsman and earned his high school equivalency while enlisted. Afterward, on an athletic scholarship at Temple University, he studied by day and tended bar by night. And somewhere in between, he noticed people weren't laughing just to be polite. They were listening. He worked his way from small Philadelphia clubs to New York's Gaslight Cafe in Greenwich Village, the kind of room where young performers stood in front of a handful of strangers and just hoped someone with real influence happened to be sitting in the back. Bill never shouted there, never chased controversy, never built a bit around anger. He talked about childhood, about school, about the strange small humiliations that happen inside every ordinary family. And audiences didn't feel performed at so much as remembered with. By the early 1960s, he'd left university to chase comedy full-time, a decision his own father thought was reckless. For a black man in that industry, in that decade, talent was never going to be enough on its own, and Bill knew it. In 1965, he was cast opposite Robert Culp in the spy series I Spy, playing Alexander Scott, not a servant, not a comic sidekick trailing a white lead, but an equal. Some southern stations refused to air the show entirely. Bill kept appearing anyway, week after week, walking into living rooms that had rarely seen a black man written with that much authority. He won 3 consecutive Emmy Awards for the role. Hollywood no longer simply knew his name, he had to reckon with it. From there he kept building best-selling comedy albums, television specials, Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids, a Saturday morning cartoon about a group of kids from a Philadelphia junkyard that Bill insisted on filling with real lessons, not just gags. He eventually went back and finished his degree, then kept going. A doctorate in education from the University of Massachusetts, earned in 1977 with a 267-page dissertation on an unlikely subject, how a cartoon could actually be used to teach a classroom something. He turned his own show into a research paper. It was the pattern of his whole life. Take what looks like entertainment and insist that it also means something. He hadn't just escaped where he came from. He built his entire public identity on the idea that education, discipline, and family could carry a person farther than the circumstances they were born into. In 1964, he married Camille Hanks. They had 5 children: Erica, Erin, Ennis, Ensa, and Evin, and those children quietly became the raw material for the comedy that made him most famous. On stage, he turned sleepless nights and family arguments into stories every parent in the room recognized instantly. He never spoke like a star above his audience. He spoke like a father who had lived through exactly what they'd lived through the night before. By 1984, those stories had become The Cosby Show. At first, Bill had pitched something else entirely: a working-class family, a limo driver for a father, maybe an electrician for a mother. It was Camille, his wife, who pushed him toward what the show eventually became. She believed audiences needed a different kind of example on their screens, a black family that was educated, accomplished, unmistakably successful, not because every black family looked that way, but because almost no show had ever let one look that way at all. Cliff Huxtable became an obstetrician. Claire Huxtable became a lawyer. 5 kids in a warm Brooklyn brownstone, in a house built to argue a point without ever raising its voice to make it. Some critics said the Huxtables were too wealthy to represent black life honestly. Bill's answer was simple. He never claimed every black family lived like the Huxtables, only that families like them existed and deserved to be seen on screen like anyone else. The show became a phenomenon. It saved a struggling network, revived a dying genre, and turned Bill into something bigger than a comedian, a father the whole country trusted. But inside that house, he still needed a son. And the boy who finally got the part looked nothing like what he'd originally pictured. Malcolm-Jamal Warner was 13 when the audition came. The cast wanted someone 15, over 6 feet tall, and Malcolm was neither, and they almost didn't bother seeing him at all. Then, on Good Friday in 1984, he came home from the movies with his mother to a stack of frantic messages from his agent. The audition was nearly over. Everyone was already packing up to leave. His mother, Pamela, took him anyway. He arrived late, after the main casting director had already left. But his first reading was enough to call the man back in. Only 3 kids were left for the role of Theo. Malcolm went last. He played it the way television usually wrote teenagers back then. Clever, a little smart-mouthed, always ready with a comeback for the adults in the room. Everyone laughed. Malcolm figured he'd nailed it. Then he looked over at Bill Cosby. Bill had his face buried in his hands. "Do you really talk to your father like that?" And Malcolm said, "No." Bill sent him back outside to try it again. Something truer than what television usually asked of a black teenager. Malcolm came back playing a real kid talking to a real father, not a punchline. "That's what I want," Bill said. Malcolm had the part by the end of the day. What made him Theo wasn't the laugh he could pull from a room. It was that he could hear a note and adjust to it, listen, change, come back better than the first try. Decades later, that was still the quality Bill remembered most about him. By the time the show wrapped, Bill had handed him even more than a role that he let Malcolm direct 5 episodes himself. Trusted him with a crew and a schedule the same way you trust someone you've stopped thinking of as a child. There was a reason the connection ran so deep. Theo was never only fiction. He was built, in part, from Ennis, Bill's real son. Tall like the boy Bill had first pictured for the role, and like Theo, would eventually become on screen dyslexic. Bill wrote his own son's struggle directly into the character, letting Theo stumble through the same difficulty and come out the other side. A piece of Ennis lived quietly inside Theo from the beginning, and off-camera, Malcolm and Ennis actually became friends. 2 boys who had no way of knowing yet how much that friendship would come to cost, decades later, in the very same breath. The show ran 8 seasons, and audiences watched Malcolm grow up in real time. Theo wrestling with grades, love, self-respect, the question of who he wanted to become. He wasn't perfect, and that was exactly the point. In the pilot episode, Theo tells his father he doesn't want college, just an ordinary life. Cliff doesn't yell. He pulls out play money and starts deducting rent, food, transportation, and taxes, until Theo sees precisely what ordinary would actually cost him. It was Bill Cosby at his sharpest, turning a lesson into a story funny enough that people would still remember it decades later. He was strict with Malcolm on set, too. He didn't want Theo flattered into the stereotype of a disrespectful black teenager, that he wanted him allowed to make mistakes and still carry real depth and self-respect. Malcolm earned an Emmy nomination at 15, but the bigger win, he said years later, was that millions of kids got to watch a black teenager grow up on television without ever being reduced to a punchline. Letters poured in for years from viewers who said the show had changed how they saw their own futures. Malcolm called that impact irreversible. History doesn't protect an image just because millions of people once loved it. On January 16, 1997, Ennis Cosby pulled over on a Los Angeles freeway to change a flat tire. He was 27, in graduate school, hoping to spend his life helping kids who struggled with learning, the way he once had. He never finished changing that tire. A robber shot him and fled the scene. Malcolm didn't just witness the man who played his father lose a son. He lost a friend of his own. Bill and Camille started a foundation in Ennis's name to fund education, trying to turn the loss into something that might help someone else. In 2018, they lost their daughter Ensa, too, to kidney disease. 2 children gone before their own parents. And alongside that grievance, another kind of loss was already moving in quietly. The slow collapse of the image Bill had spent a lifetime building. Women had been coming forward for years, accusing him of drugging and sexually assaulting them, some allegations dating back to the mid-2000s, quietly settled and largely ignored by the public at the time. What changed in 2014 was a comedian named Hannibal Buress, who brought it up during a stand-up set that spread online within days. People started asking questions they'd stopped asking a decade earlier, and this time the questions didn't go away. By the time the full weight of it landed, the accusations spanned decades and came from more than 60 people. The image of America's dad didn't just crack, it shattered completely. Reruns were pulled from television. Honors that had once been given to him were quietly revoked. In 2018, Bill was convicted of assaulting Andrea Constand and sentenced to 3 to 10 years in prison. The man who had once walked onto the Emmy stage to applause entered prison at 81. In 2021, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned the conviction on a due process technicality, not a ruling that the allegations themselves were false. He kept denying wrongdoing. His accusers kept saying they'd already waited far too long to be heard. A 2022 civil jury found him liable in the Judy Huth case. By March 2026, another jury found him liable for drugging and sexually assaulting Donna Motzinger back in 1972, awarding her $59.25 million in damages. His lawyer said the decision would be appealed. None of that can be edited out just to make Bill easier to sympathize with. His pain is real. So is the pain of the women who say he hurts them. A person can build something meaningful for millions of people and still cause harm that no achievement can erase. Those two truths don't cancel each other out simply because they're difficult to hold in the same story at the same time. Malcolm never pretended otherwise. He called the show's legacy tarnished, plainly, without flinching or excusing it. But he also refused to let the fall of one man erase what hundreds of other people had built and what the show had once meant to black families watching at home. The letters, the kids who saw a version of themselves on screen for the first time. Allowed to be smart and foolish and vulnerable and hopeful all at once. Bill Cosby built the center of that world. He was never the only person who made it real. Malcolm went on to build a full life past Theo Malcolm and Eddie Reed, Between the Lines, Sons of Anarchy, Suits, The Resident. He became a director, a spoken word artist, and a musician, winning a Grammy in 2015 with the Robert Glasper Experiment and Layla Hathaway. What he was proudest of was never becoming a teenage star. He was walking away from a famous show, building a career entirely his own, and still managing to keep himself whole through all of it. The boy Bill had once coached through an audition had grown into a father in his own right, the kind who would fly across the world for his daughter's sake without a second thought. He once said that if he had to leave tomorrow, he believed he could leave with a smile. At the time, it sounded like a quiet way of looking back on a life already well lived. After July 2025, those same words came to carry an entirely different weight. On July 20th, 2025, Malcolm was in Costa Rica with his wife Tanisha and their daughter. They'd gone for her, who was homeschooled, and the trip marked the final week of an immersion program, the part of the schedule set aside for husbands and fathers to fly in and enjoy what the rest of the family had already spent 3 weeks building. It was supposed to be the easy part of the trip. He went into the water at Playa Cocles with another man from the group. His daughter wasn't in the water with him. She was still on the sand. The water wasn't even especially deep, chest high, maybe less, but an undertow caught them both. The other man was a stronger swimmer and pulled himself free. Malcolm couldn't. A volunteer lifeguard and a nearby surfer reached him and brought him back to shore, but by then he was already gone. He was 54. His mother would say afterward that she felt chosen to be his mother, that their life together as parent and son had felt complete without anything important left unsaid. For years before his death, Pamela had spoken publicly about protecting child actors from an industry built to swallow kids whole, using her own son again and again as proof of what it looked like to come through that industry intact. Malcolm had been the exception she'd spent a career trying to make possible for others. The news moved fast through Hollywood and through everyone who'd grown up watching Theo. Then Bill Cosby spoke to a local news crew in the same city where all of this had started 3/4 of a century earlier. He remembered Malcolm as someone who always studied his character carefully, who arrived on set prepared, and who kept calling him regularly for decades after the cameras stopped, long after most working relationships like theirs would have quietly faded. By some accounts, the call telling him Malcolm was gone carried Bill straight back to the freeway in 1997 to Ennis. Not because Malcolm had never replaced him, no one replaces a child, but because a piece of Ennis had lived inside Theo for over 40 years, and Malcolm was the person who'd kept that part of the story breathing. What people close to him say stayed with Bill too was Pamela the mother, who had spent a career keeping her famous son grounded in an industry that could so easily have swallowed him whole. Perhaps that's what remains when someone lives long enough. Not the awards, not the way the public's memory of you keeps shifting, but the small details that a boy studying his lines alone in a quiet room. A mother standing behind him, a phone that used to ring every so often for 40 years, and then one day simply stopped. At 89, Bill Cosby has lost two of his own children. The young man who once played his son, and nearly the entire public image he spent more than half a century building. Some of that loss came from tragedy no one ever thinked. Some of it came from judgments this story has no right to erase. Malcolm's death doesn't make Bill a different man. It doesn't undo the verdicts, the accusers, or the years. But it does show something simpler. Behind the fallen symbol is still someone old enough to remember, a 13-year-old boy who walked into an audition room, got the scene completely wrong, and was still given one more chance. Bill asked if he really talked to his father that way. Malcolm said no, tried again, and came back as Theo Huxtable. 41 years later, that was still what Bill remembered. Not a star, not a symbol, just a boy who was ready the moment his name was called. Ennis died beside a road in 1997. Malcolm died in the water in 2025. Bill Cosby remains a man who once had all the lines for every family in America, and now, with both of his sons gone, has only silence left to say them in. What do you do with someone who taught a child how to become good while causing harm he never took back? Maybe that isn't a question with a clean answer. Maybe it's just one worth sitting with.